Hello and welcome to the May 10th edition of This Week in South Carolina in Session. I'm Gavin Jackson here at the State House on this Sine Day here in Columbia. Well, we saw some rapid fire movements today in the State House, as we always do on Sine Day, which is the last day of the legislative session. It's worth noting that this is the last day of a 2-year session, so all bills that did not get passed to the governor's desk or are not in conference committee are now dead and will have to be reintroduced next January when the new session begins. But that's a long ways away. Let's talk about what we saw happen today, and that was some landmark education policy legislation moving through the Senate. We saw the Senate, and with 5 minutes till 5 p.m., which is when the clock strikes for Sine Day to go into effect, we saw them pass through a constitutional referendum bill that would ask the voters if they would prefer the governor to appoint the superintendent of education or if they would prefer voters to continue electing that position. Now, this move is monumental because it would give governors the power to appoint a superintendent so they can control their own education priorities for once. Right now, they are kind of at the whim of an elected position and hope that they can kind of consolidate their policy with the superintendent of education's policy, as well as their spending priorities. Right now, if this would go to the voters in a referendum, voters would answer yes or no if they want that to happen. And in 2022, whoever wins the gubernatorial race in 2022 will be able to appoint their superintendent of education. That is, if the voters approve that measure. However, we've seen several measures in the past get approved, like the lieutenant governor being on a joint ticket, as well as the adjutant general becoming an appointed position. Both of those measures were constitutional referendums appointed by, decided by the voters. So there's hope and there's an expectation that voters would do the same should they be asked about the superintendent of education. So more on that in a minute, but again, very monumental, very big moment. A lot of people for decades have been pushing for that bill, and it got across the finish line with 5 minutes left in session today. Also, big legislation moving across in the Senate was the Baseload Review Act repeal bill. Now, we saw senators debating that bill yesterday, and there is some contention over it as well. But during today, we did see them amend it, so it included the Baseload Review Act repeal, as well as the Consumer Advocate bill. That's a separate bill that was amended into this bill, so it would give create a consumer advocate position for utility regulators so they could represent customers before state regulators when it comes to utility rate hikes in the future. Also, this bill would give the Office of Regulatory Staff subpoena power to investigate claims against utility companies. So major legislation there, of course, and that made it back to the House from the Senate. There's some contentions there, so it's going to a conference committee like the other conference committee that we've already been seeing meeting, dealing with that SC&G nuclear premium on SC&G customers' bills, that 18% that funds the failed VC summer project. So a lot going on when it comes to utility reform. A lot of that stuff has obviously been pushed to the last minute, but it's moving, and lawmakers will be taking that up in conference committees after today. So a lot of movement there. And we also caught up with House Speaker Jay Lucas. We always talk to him at the end of the year. We got his thoughts on how things shaped up this year. And we also spoke with House Minority Leader Todd Rutherford, a Democrat from Columbia, to get his opinion on some things that he said didn't get done this year that he would have liked to have seen. And we also want to just start off right now. And there's a bunch of other bills too we can mention at the end there, like the cigarette butt ban bill that got passed, the bill overhauling the disturbing schools law. That's that contentious, very broadly written law that's on the books that can allow students to be arrested should they be found to disturb schools. It's a very broad bill. Is now going to be overhauled. So that bill's going to the governor as well for his signature potentially. So a lot of bills happened today, a lot of bills move back and forth, but I'm going to start right now with that landmark legislation that's heading to the governor's desk that would ask voters if they want the superintendent of education to be an appointed position rather than an elected position. Let's start right now.
I have had my name on the bill for probably close to 2 years. I think it's a bad idea to change the current selection of the state superintendent of education from being elected by the people of South Carolina to be appointed by the governor, whoever the governor may be, now and going forward. As I said earlier, or as I said earlier this week, we spend about 40%, or we allocated about 40% of our general fund budget to public education. And it scares me to think that that much authority and that much of our state revenue, our state budget, will be placed in the hands of one person to do the appointment. I think that we have information that shows that when we have, in states where we have appointed superintendents of education, the cost that they spend per child is more than it is when we have an elected superintendent. And in just about every category, the test scores are higher under an elected superintendent. One thing about an elected superintendent of education, they will have to campaign just as we do, and they will have to let us know what they stand for, what they don't stand for, what their platform is, so that the people of South Carolina can make an educated guess as far as who they want to lead the State Department of Education. If that person is appointed, they may just have to dance to the beat of the governor.
Today, people have no idea who they're voting for when they vote for superintendent of education or agricultural commissioner or secretary of state or treasurer or comptroller general. They have no idea. A very few of the population know. They do know who they're voting for when they vote for governor, at least more than they do the down ballot races. A lot of them don't know that either. I think it's important when you have an issue as important.
Senator from Florence, for what purpose do you rise?
When the Senate gets to a break in its thoughts, I'd like to ask him a question.
Let me finish this thought and then I'll yield. When an issue as important as public education, I would like to think that the voters at least know a little bit about the person that they're voting for who will have influence over it. Let me be clear, education's not going to get better just because we do this. It's not. The core problems we have in South Carolina's education are not related to who's run the Department of Education in the least bit. The core problems we have are a lack of leadership in the executive branch and the issues that we see come through this General Assembly on the local level and related to funding.
Now, it's worth noting that that vote happened very discreetly after about close to an hour and a half, 2 hours of debate by Senator Gerald Malloy. He made the move that that bill be, that all senators unanimously apply, and that bill was, and after several hours of debate on that bill, which worried some that it could actually, quash the entire day, they did move for that vote. However, that vote was not done by roll call voting when the reading clerk usually asks people their name and how they want to vote on it. Rather, this bill was done by unanimous consent request, and that it was a unanimous consent that the entire roll of the Senate be applied in favor of the bill, and those who objected to the bill could go up to the desk and tell them they objected to the bill. Well, it came out to a 38-6 vote, if I'm correct on that, and we did not get all the names of who voted against it at this time, but they did need 2/3, and it was 38-6. They did need 2/3 of people in the Senate to vote for this. They needed 30. They got 38, so it did pass. But again, a very discreet way of voting. We didn't get to hear who voted for or against it during that time, which again took place minutes before 5 p.m. today. So very shocking news out of the Senate today. Also, we saw that the senators did move along that Baseload Review Act repeal bill. We had some clips from Senator Massey about that yesterday, about exactly what it did. It did go back over to the House, where they voted not to concur with the changes that the Senate made, which sent that bill now to a conference committee. So lawmakers will still be taking up utility reform bills even after the session ended today. So let's get some clips in here about that bill that got passed out of the Senate today.
And I'll just talk about the Judiciary Amendment because it strikes a good bit of things that were in the original version. The House bill had a lot of language in it, but what the Senate Judiciary Committee version would do is it would cut off everything with the Baseload Review Act as soon as the existing litigation ends. The PSC could accept no more applications regarding Baseload Review Act. All right, so the only thing that they could ever consider would be those things that are pending now. Everything else would be prohibited. And so therefore, you essentially repeal the Baseload Review Act going forward. Also, the language in the House version included definitions, statutory definitions for imprudence and prudence, because those are very important terms, especially in the case that the PSC has to consider regarding the Baseload Review Act going forward. we modified those definitions some. They included some examples, and we pulled those examples out at the subcommittee level. So now it's really kind of a Merriam-Webster definition of what imprudence is and prudence is. And those really are the only. This bill 4379 is a bill that it deals primarily with consumer advocate. There are 4 main bullet points that I want to hit on. The primary one is, so we already have a consumer advocate. The advocate just doesn't deal with utility rate cases. And so what we would do in Judiciary Committee Amendment is we would have the consumer advocate who is at the Department of Consumer Affairs, which is different than the bill that was passed by the House of Representatives. They had the consumer advocate at the Attorney General's office. We've got it in the Department of Consumer Affairs because there's already a consumer advocate there who does other issues, and they've got that experience. So we thought that made sense. However, right now, the consumer advocate has to have 3 years of legal experience. We upped that to a minimum requirement of 8 years legal experience. I think that was Senator from Darlington's suggestion because that's the requirement, I believe, for judges. And so we added that increased qualification for the consumer advocate. Importantly, what this does is it would require that the Public Service Commission notify the consumer advocate on any proceeding that is filed before the Public Service Commission and that could impact consumers' rates. And
we also caught up with House Speaker Jay Lucas, the Republican from Darlington County, and we got to pick his brain a little bit about what he thought about the session this year and some other bills that he saw going through, as well as what he expects to see happen next year. I know we're months away from that happening next year, but I just want to get his thoughts on what he expects to see happening in terms of the big topics that could be on tap for next year.
Great thing about all the work that the House did is that it's still alive and well. When you talk about PSC reform, when you talk about ORS reform, when you're talking about lowering the nuclear premium to zero, everything the House has advocated for is still in play, and that tale will certainly be told over the next couple of weeks. But I'm excited that we still have the opportunity to deal with those issues. You know, I didn't think it was moving at quite the pace that I wanted it to move, but when you figure at the end we got conformity done, which is huge for the South Carolina taxpayer. You know, we've got other issues done that I think are also equally important. The fact that we passed the Superintendent of Education bill, I mean, that is big to do that on the last day. Now, obviously, with regard to education, I'm a little disappointed we didn't get our computer programming bill through. You know, I thought that was an incredibly important piece of legislation. One of our last Abbeville bills, the capital improvement bond bill, you know, continue to think that was important. It's been in the Senate for 2 years. It didn't get sent back to us, so we'll just continue to deal with that bill next legislative session. But it did, despite the fact that it appeared we were moving a little slowly at times. I think in the end we got a lot done. No question, outstanding success. You know, with the time and effort the House has put into opioids, and you know, I want to point out that the South Carolina House has taken the lead on this issue, not only in South Carolina but across the United States. You know, I think we've been first to bat on that issue. I think about 90% of our bills made it through. It's a crisis. It's a crisis that not only affects, you know, families in South Carolina, but workforce. We got to get people to work. We hear from the Chamber of Commerce that we've got to make a dent in the opioid crisis, and I think we did that this year. I'm very proud of that committee. I'm very proud of the fact that the legislation got through, and you know, the Senate, they like to give me a hard time sometimes, but I want to give them a shout out for actually getting on that legislation and sending it back to us. It's you know, it two branches of the legislature, and I think we thought we worked together well to get those bills back.
And likewise, we heard from House Minority Leader Todd Rutherford, a Democrat from here in Columbia, about his thoughts on the legislative session, as well as what he would have liked to have seen gone through.
It is disappointing that we didn't even have a hearing on it, that we didn't get to talk about those things that are important to a lot of South Carolinians in terms of protecting our schools. We did, however, put in the budget money for school resource officers to make sure that those schools that don't currently have one could hopefully afford to get one, but we didn't do enough to make sure that children are protected from themselves. And so hopefully in the near future we will have some hearings on that. but I don't know exactly when that'll be. The fact that we have not brought a medical marijuana bill and let it go to both bodies and get a full vote on it is disappointing to me. There's so many people in South Carolina that are hurting that want help, and we can give it to them. We can also look to raise taxes off of that so that we'd have a new source of revenue. In addition, luxury gambling that we haven't considered in both bodies to make sure that, again, we're not constantly digging into taxpayers' pockets to fund government. We need to look at alternative funding sources. Those are two of them that didn't see the light of day this year. I am going to predict that next year it'll be a whole nother story as it relates to medical marijuana. I think those people that have been dying for it, literally dying for it, are going to see a change next year.
And we saw some other bills going through today. That marching band bill that would allow marching band students to count their practice time towards physical education credits did get approved after a quick conference committee meeting today. Got sent out to the governor's desk. It relegates a lot of control to the local school districts to determine whether schools can do that or not. And it also included some opioid prevention education curriculum requirements for all schools to adhere to. Again, that's something that's going to be dealt more with at the local level, but it does give guidance on how they want those opioid-related prevention curriculum dictated to the school district. So, and there's also some more opioid-related legislation moving through this year. We saw a bill that would would limit the number of days a prescription for opioids could be prescribed to for a patient, notwithstanding cancer patients or others with acute or constant pain. So this bill would actually only allow prescribers to give out a 7-day prescription for opioids with the possibility of getting more should the patient need them. But it's just another way that this legislature is trying to crack down on that growing epidemic that South Carolina is definitely part of, as well as is the rest of the country. We also did see a bill that would make it a misdemeanor to litter cigarette butts. We talked about this yesterday. If you flick a cigarette butt out of your car window on public or private property, or on the beach, or on a waterway in the state of South Carolina, you could soon be facing a misdemeanor charge and a fine of up to $100. So get ready for that one. That is if the governor signs it, but a lot of people always want to crack down on the litter problem in the state of South Carolina, so can't imagine him vetoing that bill. And there's also the bill that would overturn the controversial disturbing schools law, that really broadly written law that we've seen take place back in 2015 at Spring Valley High School, when that one student was ejected from her chair for not following orders from her teacher or that school resource officer. Well, this bill is aimed to rewrite that law and overhaul